Just wondered, how big a risk was it for Mrs. Thatcher to send a task force to the Falklands at the time? It seems now that it was inevitable that we would reclaim the Falklands, but how inevitable was it at the time when she actually made that decision?
It was. There's no doubt that it was a bit nip and tuck. As I said, it was 8,000 miles. The reality is, actually, there are only two nations in the world that could have done it. One is the Americans and ourselves. The Russians didn't have sufficient aircraft on aircraft carriers to do it. The French didn't have sufficient amphibious ships to do it. So there are only two countries who could do it. The Americans, of course, had huge power and could have done it. Although I have to say, probably they'd have ended up killing nearly everyone in the Falklands. That's the way they go about things. It was initially felt in the UK when the invasion took place, the advice from the Ministry of Defence, because the Chief of Defence Staff was in New Zealand, but from the Ministry of Defence was, we can't do this, it can't be done, we can't do anything militarily, we'll have to try and negotiate. Well, Henry Leach, who was the first Sea Lord, he heard that Margaret Thatcher was meeting with the Foreign Secretary and the Defence Secretary in Parliament. He rushed there in uniform and burst in on the meeting, and the Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, said, "What are you doing here?" And he said, "I've come to say, Prime Minister, that I can pull a task force together and we can recover these islands." And then he said something he felt he shouldn't as First Lord. He said, "And I think we should do that, Prime Minister, because otherwise tomorrow we'll be a very different nation." And Margaret Thatcher, of course, absolutely jumped at this opportunity, having been told nothing militarily could be done. To be told it could, she seized the opportunity, and she released in the next couple of days £2.5 billion from the reserve. Remember, this was in 1982, and that money was, of course, used doing things to ships and the like, and the task group to be able to go down there. And the task force sailed very quickly indeed. It's interesting looking today, isn't it, that we have a war going on in Europe, in the Ukraine, and the possibility of a world war. God forfend that happens. And yet, actually, the government haven't increased any or put any extra money into the armed forces. But that's an aside, but I am amazed by that. And so the force sailed for the south, and of course the winter was about to approach in the South Atlantic. You know, terrible sea states down there, horrible weather. But our Navy had been used to operating right up in the North Atlantic, right up in the Arctic, countering the Russians in the Cold War. And so we were used to doing that. And we were able to get down there. We lost a number of ships getting our forces ashore, but we landed 5,000 troops, 5,000 tons of equipment without any of that being lost at all. We lost ships protecting it, but that landed. And once it was ashore, although there was some stiff fighting at times, it was a foregone conclusion. We were going to win. And that's why it all happened so quickly.
And just in a short sentence, if you could, I guess the key question is, do we have the defence capability to do the same thing today, should we be in the same situation?
If you'd asked me that 4 years ago, I'd have said absolutely not, because you can only do this sort of operation this far from your country if you have aircraft carriers. And now, thank goodness, we have got aircraft carriers again. But as regards the supporting ships, I think at the time of the Falklands, we had something like 70 or so, 75 escorts, frigates and destroyers. Our nation now has 18, which is a national disgrace. And so I think in those terms, it would be difficult. Another thing is we use 76 merchant ships in retaking the Falklands. And of course, they were manned by British merchant sailors. And we can see from this P&O thing going on at the moment, we're getting less and less British merchant sailors because the firms rather like employing cheap foreign sailors. But when you're in a war, you can't rely on them to fight for you. So there are a number of things like that that would make it much more difficult.